She stood barefoot in the frost, her baby burning with fever in her arms, and the pharmacist slammed the door in her face. "You should have thought about your child before you sinned," he said. That night, she thought no one saw her tears. But the next morning, something appeared on her porch. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind in Dry Creek could be kind or cruel depending on what it carried. That spring, it bore no scent of wildflowers, only the sourness of whispered judgment. Ellie Mathers knew it well, the way conversations would still as she approached, how eyes would slide off her like water from stone. They did not shout or accuse. They didn't need to. The absence of kindness was its own loud verdict. She wore no ring, no explanation pinned to her shawl, no father by her side. Just the baby. Samuel. Pink-cheeked, always hungry, and most dangerous of all, visible. He made no apology for existing, and neither did she. Ellie had once been a girl who danced barefoot in churchyard picnics, who memorized verses to recite aloud at Easter, whose laughter fit neatly into the soft fabric of the town. But that girl had vanished the moment her belly grew. She'd felt it the night she left the city, clutching a note that said nothing more than, "You're on your own now." She'd burned it in the hearth and packed a cradle instead. Her mother's house had long been sold off to pay debts, so she found lodging in a one-room lean-to behind old Mr. Darnell's livery, 4 thin walls and a rust-streaked stove that coughed when lit. It leaned with the weariness of years, but it had a door that closed and a window that caught the sunrise just right. Ellie made it a home with scraps, a quilt sewn from her father's shirts, a battered kettle from the general store's clearance shelf, and a ribbon of lavender tucked into Samuel's cradle. At night, when the child slept and the town did not, she'd scrub petticoats until her hands blistered. She saved every coin and never looked anyone in the eye longer than a heartbeat. There was no room for softness, not in a place where the church pews were more rigid than the law, and forgiveness came only with proof of remorse she refused to counterfeit. She didn't seek pity. She didn't want it. But there were moments, small ones, that rooted themselves like wildflowers in cracked stone. A stranger's glance without disdain. The wind shifting to carry birdsong instead of rumor. A door left open just long enough for warmth to spill through. And once, a hand, large, weathered, lifting her burden at the feed store without a word, only a nod. It was the quiet kind of mercy. The kind that didn't ask who you were or what you'd done, just whether you could use a moment's grace. Porch railings in Dry Creek bore many burdens, rocking chairs, flower boxes, and on most days, the slow, satisfied silence of women watching the world they believed they ruled. But when Ellie Mathers passed by, the porches turned cold. Conversations thinned to murmurs, rocking chairs stilled mid-creek. It wasn't anger that met her eyes. It was dismissal. The kind that came not from heat, but from distance. She wasn't part of their world anymore. She had stepped outside the line, and no one had invited her back. The irony was, Ellie never asked to be welcomed. She only asked to live. Morning started before dawn, with her fingers in cold water and Samuel's breath warming the inside of her wrist as she nursed him while folding laundry. By the time the rest of the town stirred, Ellie had scrubbed the clothes of half its women, pious dresses, aprons with ribbons, sheets stained with rosewater and pride. They never looked her in the eye when they dropped off their bundles, never thanked her when she returned them white as bone. But they talked. Lord, how they talked. "She kept the baby just for attention," someone muttered outside the bakery. "She's trying to trap a husband," another said near the butcher's. It wasn't just the whispers. It was the ritual of erasure. She was the unspoken exception. At quilting circles, when future brides were praised for their modesty, no one said Ellie's name, though she stitched straighter lines than most. When someone mentioned single motherhood, it came with a tilt of the head toward the livery shed. Still, Ellie moved as if none of it mattered. Her hands were always busy, fixing a frayed hem for a neighbor's child, sharing a half-loaf of bread with the Thompson boy whose father drank away wages. She gave without asking, as if kindness were her only currency and the world still owed her nothing. Then came the night Samuel burned with fever. No time to hitch a wagon, no boots on her feet. Just a mother, barefoot through frostbite wind, knocking on the pharmacist's door with a baby burning in her arms. And the door didn't open wide. It opened just enough for a sentence, cold as the night. You should have thought about your child before you sinned. She stood there, blinking back tears that stung worse than the air, before turning back to the dark. She never told anyone what she whispered to Samuel when they lay curled on the floor, her shawl over both their bodies, the hearth cold and cruel. But the next morning, a basket waited. Not from the town, not from the church, from a man who asked no questions, just offered what he could. And that was more grace than she'd been shown in months. The thaw came slowly that year. Snow lingered in stubborn patches, like the town's memory of who Ellie Mathers used to be. But something beneath it had begun to shift, something quieter than forgiveness, sturdier than hope. It was not redemption through thunderclaps or grand apologies. It was, instead, a thread being pulled one stitch at a time. Thomas Avery never brought flowers or poetry. What he brought were broken things, straps frayed from cattle poles, shirts with buttons dangling like loose promises, curtains torn by prairie winds. Ellie mended them all with practiced fingers, her needle moving steadily even when her heart fluttered at the sound of his boots on her porch. He'd sit while she worked, drinking her thin coffee without complaint, his silence full but never heavy. He never asked about Samuel's father, never spoke of the rumors that hung over her like laundry on a line. He spoke of wood rot, cattle feed, and once, unexpectedly, of music. "My wife used to hum hymns when she stitched," he said one afternoon, gazing at the patch of sunlight where Samuel lay napping. "You sew quieter." Ellie looked up, startled. "Do you miss the noise?" Thomas shook his head. "No, just noticing." It wasn't flirtation, it was witness, and that, in Dry Creek, meant more than roses. When he brought firewood, she knew better than to call it charity. He placed it beside the door, saying only that too much of it might go to waste. She didn't argue. She simply thanked him, and when he reached down to brush Samuel's fist with a fingertip rough from reins and rope, she felt a stillness inside her that hadn't existed since the day she'd returned. The boy gurgled in his sleep, grasping at air, and Thomas whispered, "He's got grip." Ellie's mouth tugged toward a smile she hadn't practiced in months. "He holds on tight," she said softly. Word got around, as word always does. Mrs. Bellows rolled her eyes so hard at church one Sunday she nearly tipped her bonnet. "He could have married a widow with standing," she hissed to her pewmate. "Instead, he's courting sin in a skirt." But Dry Creek was watching how Ellie's shoulders no longer slumped beneath invisible weight, how the child she held laughed with all his small lungs, how her porch now bore the scent of split wood and stitched fabric instead of shame. It was not a return to grace. It was the building of something new, grace that did not need permission. The fairgrounds were stitched with the scent of clover and dust, the kind of air that only arrived after the last frost had retreated and the earth dared to believe again. Ellie stood just inside the gate, her hand curled tightly around Samuel's mittened one. She wore her best dress, faded blue cotton with a mended hem, and a scarf tied carefully under her chin, not for modesty, but for armor. The voices of Dry Creek hummed in the air like bees near a hive, cautious, curious, never quite cruel, but always watching. She hadn't planned to come. The fair meant exposure, open paths, open judgment. But that morning, Thomas had arrived on her porch with the same stillness he always carried, his eyes warm beneath a brim brushed free of dust for the first time in weeks. The second basket he held was lined in gingham, filled not with offerings but invitation. "Thought Samuel might like to see the pigs." He didn't say you, but she understood, and after a moment's breath, she nodded. The walk through the fairgrounds was slow, not from shame anymore, but because Samuel insisted on stopping to wave at every dog and point at every balloon. When Thomas lifted him onto his shoulders, Ellie caught her breath, not from surprise but from the sight of it. Her son, giggling, balanced against a man who did not flinch from weight. The pie tent was strung with bunting that swayed like breath. Cinnamon hung in the air, and laughter spilled from a group of women Ellie might once have stood among. She didn't approach, but she didn't lower her gaze either. Thomas stepped beside her, his tone low enough that only she could hear. "I've got no right to ask," he began, and the way he said it, careful, reverent, made her heart twist. "But I was wondering, does your boy need a last name?" She turned to him. His face wasn't polished or perfect. It was wind-scuffed, lined by years and weather. But his eyes held no pity, just something steadier. She swallowed hard. "He does." Thomas's hand, so often used to break horses and split logs, reached for hers with a trembling that humbled her more than any sermon ever had. "I'd be honored if it was mine." No kiss, no applause, just the quiet brush of skin against skin, and the laughter of a child sticky with apple juice, crowing from his perch like he'd won the day. Which, perhaps, he had. Ellie stood with her hand in Thomas's, her shoulders square beneath the spring sun. She had not asked for forgiveness. She had asked for nothing at all. And yet, here it was, offered not because she begged, but because she endured. Because someone had finally looked at her not as a mistake to be shunned, but as a life worth joining. Not for who she had been, but for everything still to come.